This talk and the JavaScript for WordPress conference are brought to you by our sponsors at 10up and WP Buffs. 10up makes a better web with finely crafted websites and tools for content creators. Check out their junior and senior dev positions at 10up.com/careers. WP Buffs provides 24/7 fully managed support and white label agency services. Find out how they can help you focus on what you do best at wpbuffs.com/partnerships.
Well, thanks for having me. So I'll be talking about WP GraphQL, the WordPress plugin that brings GraphQL API to WordPress. Let's get into this. So what I want to cover today, what is GraphQL? I imagine a lot of people haven't heard of it or don't know a whole lot about it, so I want to cover what it is. I want to look at what WordPress looks like as an application data graph, and then we'll look at basic usage of WP GraphQL to query data from WordPress using GraphQL. And then we'll take a peek at how we could build a Gutenberg block using GraphQL to get the data for the Gutenberg block. It's a lot to cover, so I'll do my best to get through it. You can find me online, Twitter, at Jason Bahl or at WP GraphQL if you want to connect later. Let's get to it. So GraphQL, this is the most text I have on any slide, so bear with me. But GraphQL is a query language for your API. GraphQL is a query language for APIs and a runtime for fulfilling those queries with your existing data. GraphQL provides a complete and understandable description of the data in your API, gives clients the power to ask for exactly what they need and nothing more, makes it easier to evolve APIs over time, and enables powerful developer tools. You can learn more about GraphQL also at graphql.org. So GraphQL, one misconception, some people think GraphQL has something to do with graph databases like Neo4j or other technology like that, which is not the case. Although it can connect to graph databases, that's not what it means. Graph also does not mean graph search. Facebook introduced a feature several years ago, Graph API, where you could search Facebook data. Not that, even though GraphQL was open source by Facebook, it's not that. So in GraphQL, graph stands for application data graph, and QL stands for query language. So GraphQL is a query language for an application data graph. So what that looks like, GraphQL query looks something like this. This is kind of the hello world of a GraphQL query. It essentially looks like a JSON keys without the values. So in this case, this query might be requesting for something me, and on me, we want the field name. And a result would look like actual JSON with the keys and values. So if we ask for me and name, we get me, name, and it resolves to Jason Bahl as the name. So that's kind of like the hello world. Let's take a look at what WordPress as an application data graph looks like. And then we'll circle back to how we can use these queries to actually interact with data from WordPress. So at the heart of WordPress, we have posts or other post types, books or pages or products or whatever it might be. Posts have properties, something like a title. That title resolves to something concrete, a string, hello world. Those posts also have connections to other things in this graph of data. So posts might have an image, it might have categories, and those nodes have properties as well that resolve to something concrete, like we might have the category news or category crime. But those categories might also have other connections to other posts, which also have properties as well, or the category might even have an image connected to it. And it goes on and on. We have this graph of data that's basically endless graph of things connecting to each other that have properties and other connections. So that's kind of what a graph looks like visually. And so GraphQL lets us pick trees out of the application data graph. So what that means is I can send a GraphQL query that looks something like this as an example, where I say, hey, GraphQL, I want to query, and when I query, I want to post by this specific ID. And on that post, I want a title, I want the link to the post, I want the categories, and for each of those category nodes, I want the name. We might get a result that looks something like this. Looks just like what I asked for. I asked for a post, I get a post. I asked for the title, the link, and the categories. I get the title, the link, and the categories. And on each category node, I asked for the name, and I'm getting the name. So visually, that same graph, this is what that looks like. In blue, you see what I asked for was one post, just the categories and the names. So I get just that set of data out of the graph and nothing else. So WP GraphQL now is a free open source WordPress plugin that provides an extendable GraphQL schema and API for any WordPress site. I want to do a shout out. We've got a lot of contributors. I'm kind of leading the project, but at the moment we have, I think, about 30 contributors. So I just want to shout out to all them. This is an outdated slide. I think only showing, what, 15 or so. But we have like 30 or so looking for more help if anybody's interested in it. But anyway, so I want to show how to use GraphQL with WordPress. So this is kind of what WordPress looks like today. We have a persistence layer, MySQL. Then we have business logic layer, which is basically the PHP application as a whole. It's basically what WordPress is. We have authorization layers, you know, current user can, checks, things like that. And then we have REST API as of, you know, what, 2 years ago now, and RPC, which is an API that's existed for quite some time. So WP GraphQL sits at this same level as REST and RPC. So it's an API that still respects authorization of WordPress, the business logic, so the filters, you know, post type registries, things like that. And then it still gets data out of the persistence layer. But it opens up, you can also get data out from, not MySQL if you want to, but I'm not going to cover that today. So yeah, when you install WP GraphQL, it turns WordPress into a graph. So at WordPress, we have posts, we have users, we have comments and pages and terms and media, and all these things have these connections. So when you install the plugin, it brings GraphQL to WordPress. So very simple to add the plugin to WordPress and start using it today. Visit GitHub. It's not on the .org repo right now. It might be someday, but for now it's on GitHub. So visit github.com/wp-graphql. /WP-GraphQL. That's the main plugin. Of course, star the repo. No, I'm just joking. Of course, tweet about how awesome it is to use GraphQL with WordPress. That's obviously the next step. And then clone or download the plugin, then install and activate. So it's that easy. Once you install and activate, you'll have a GraphQL endpoint. So yoursite.com/GraphQL. And I'll show what that looks like in a minute. So here's an example. I'm going to install two plugins here. So we have WP GraphQL and WP GraphQL. GraphQL is an IDE, also open source by Facebook, that allows you to experiment with GraphQL queries and mutations. And I'll be showing how to use that very shortly. So yeah, you install these two plugins, activate them. You'll get this GraphQL IDE in your WordPress dashboard, where you can actually start playing with GraphQL operations inside your WordPress dashboard. I'll actually show you what that looks like live right now. So I have a local site running with the plugin active. So I have this graphical panel here, or a menu page, and I can just start playing around with queries. So one cool thing about GraphQL is that it has a self-documenting schema. So as you register things to the GraphQL schema, it's automatically documented here, and you can browse the documentation in a tool like GraphQL. So at the root of the schema, we have a query and mutation. Query allows us to read data from the graph. Mutation allows us to write data to the graph. So I can browse what all my capabilities are to do this, but let's say we just want to find posts. I can search posts, and then I can find what all I can do with posts, and then figure out what my capabilities are. Or over on this left side, I can just start typing post nodes ID title. So this will give me a list of posts, and on that list I'll get a node for each post, and then the ID and the title, and then I can click this play button to execute it, and I'll get a list of posts with each node and title. So I'm getting just exactly what I'm asking for, nothing more, nothing less. I can ask for a link, things like that. So that's what GraphQL is. You can install it in your WP admin. Let me get back to these slides. So I also put up a resource called playground.wpgraphql.com, which kind of walks step by step through some basic GraphQL queries to more advanced features of the GraphQL language. So I'll walk you through some of this, and then we'll jump into how we can use GraphQL to create a Gutenberg block. So if this loads, let's take a look. Come on, man. Oh, all right, here we go. So this is just a quick little playground environment I set up. You can visit this in your browser. It's a live GraphQL endpoint. But yeah, so you can walk through all these different queries, and you'll see different queries as an example of what kind of things you can execute against a GraphQL WP GraphQL API. So like this one, we can get a list of posts, edges, node, and then the ID, the title, the date, and the excerpt. This is on free hosting, so it might not exactly be fast, but we should see a result here. And I'm guessing a lot of people are hitting this at the same time. So yeah, so we can hit this up and we'll get the results back here. So you can walk through on your own time. I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can do things like arguments, like pass an ID of a post to get an individual post. And in this case, we'll get one post back when it loads. I might switch to do some of this locally, might be faster. All right, I will run some of these locally so you can see without the delay. I don't know what's going on with that server. So another one we could do is like query pages. So I can get a list of pages, for example, and then, of course, that's not working. What's going on? Of course, live demos always kill you. All right, I don't know what happened with that one. So here's an example of how we can do some really deeply nested queries. So some categories, and then on the categories, I want the edges and node. And let me explain for a second what edges and node mean. So if you go back to the visualization of what GraphQL looks like, or what WordPress looks like as a data graph. So we have these nodes, like a category is a node, a post is a node, a category an image. All these things are nodes. Edges is this space between. So between the category and the post, kind of this space here, we have this space between two nodes. So like anytime there's two things that are connected to each other, there's oftentimes properties that only belong to the relationship itself. So like in a social network, think of like I'm a friend, or I'm a user and I have friends. There might be data on the date that I became a friend with you. So that's not a property of me as a user, and it's not a property of you as a user. It's a property of the connection between us. So that's where edge data can live in a GraphQL schema. So you have this edge between two connected nodes. So that's when you see GraphQL queries that have edges and node. As I'm going through things, that's what that means. So this allows you to do like really deeply nested things. I don't have that kind of data in this environment, so you're not going to see anything from this one. Looks like my playground might be back up. Let's try that. All right, this one's better. This environment actually has data, so well, of course. I might want to pull it up, but it doesn't work again. Yeah, here we go. So I can list out categories, and if they have children, I'll get a list of the children and the children's children and the children's children. So I can do these like deeply nested queries and get exactly what I want and nothing more. So yeah, you can see the data getting back. I can also query users, Some data is going to be private, some of it's going to be public. Private data, you have to be authenticated to access. Just like mutations, you have to be authenticated to mutate data as well. I can also query for things like plugins. Like if I was going to build a decoupled admin where I needed to interact with plugins, I can query for plugins to see like what is available in any given environment and build a UI to interact with that. Same thing with themes. I can query a list of what themes are available on any given site. Oops. And then we can also query settings. This is one thing I think the REST API doesn't allow you to query settings unless you're authenticated already. But there's some things in settings that I think no matter what you're building with like a decoupled JavaScript interface, you're probably going to want things like the title of the site, the URL of the site, maybe the language that the site is set to. Various default settings like discussion settings and reading settings like the post per page and whatnot. Oh, and I got something broken here. Let's try that again. So there's various fields that if you're building a decoupled API, you want this data out of your WordPress database. And the REST API right now you have to be authenticated, but if you're building a public application, data that should be public should be treated public probably. But anyway, so let's get into some of the more nuanced features of the GraphQL language. So GraphQL, I can compose these kind of deep queries, but on any given field, I can also pass arguments. So in this case, I'm querying posts, right? And then inside those posts, I'm asking for categories and author, but I'm only asking for 5 posts. So I can say, give me just the first 5 posts. And on those categories are nested, right? But in my case, I want them to be output in a flat list. I don't want them to be nested. So I can pass an argument like this: should output in flat list true, and first 5 posts. So when I execute this, you'll see that I'll actually get this list of post edges, and then the categories, I'll get a flat list of categories instead of like a nested. So here's an example of one. I'll get this list of categories in a flat list, even if they're nested categories, right? Even if one's the child of another category. And you can see I can, in a REST API, I'd have to do a query first to get these posts. There is category data to some degree stored with like in the REST response by default, whether I want it or not. In REST, I'm going to get it. But then like on author, like avatar is a completely different resource, right? And I can ask for that data here without making a separate request. And then, and I'm only getting the data that I'm asking for. I'm not getting anything extra. So yeah, it's real cool stuff. I can also do completely separate root queries. So at the root of my query, I can ask for posts and users as 2 separate asks, right? So if I want a list of 5 posts and a list of 2 users for whatever I'm building, instead of having to make 2 separate HTTP requests, like in a REST API, I can make 1 request asking for posts and 1 request asking for users, and I can get that data on both of them. There's also something called fragments in GraphQL. So I can break out pieces of my query into what's called a fragment. So I can define a fragment. So in this case, I'm going to say fragment post on the type post. These are the fields I want. And I can even use another fragment inside that fragment. So when I execute this, it's going to query 1 post because I'm specifying just 1 post. And on that, I'm going to get a node with these fields. So if I execute this, you'll see I'm going to get the ID, the title, the date, the link, the excerpt, the author. So all this stuff that I'm asking for, if I change these fragments, like let's say I just want the ID and the title, and I want to execute that again, I'm only going to get the ID and the title. So the fragments are very powerful, and I'll show you when I dive into some code for Gutenberg how that can be very powerful as you're doing client-side development. Another powerful feature is aliases. So with GraphQL, I can tell GraphQL, hey, when I make this request, I want this field to be called something different than the schema has it defined as. And when I get that response, I want it to be called what I want it to be called. So in this case, I'm going to query posts, the nodes, the ID, the title, and the excerpt. But when I want that back, I want it to be called card list. And instead of nodes, I want it to be called cards. And on each card, I want it to be called key, card title, and card description. And here you'll see the response matches what I asked for. I don't have to do a client-side transformation in my React or whatever. Yeah, I'm seeing some questions. I'll try and get back to those at the end. And then here's an example of some more aliases. So now I can ask for posts and categories, and I can use aliases to get the data in the same shape. So I can get a list of posts, call them cards. I can get a type name back. I can get the key, the title, let's see, description and link. And then same thing, I can get the type name, key, title, description, and link. So I'm talking to two different sets of data, but I'm getting them in the same shape, right? So what's cool about that now is I can build one component, one card component, for example, a card component like this that expects a key, a title, a type name, a description, and a link. And now I can use that exact same component, and I can actually render out posts with that component or terms with that component. And this is literally all the code we need to do that, right? It's the GraphQL query with the aliases. It's the React component, the card component that just maps over. I'm just mapping over the list, and I'm outputting it, right? So we can build one component, and I can source it from terms, or I can source it from posts, and I don't have to build like a specific, post card component or term card component if I don't want to. You can, of course, if you want. But another cool thing with GraphQL is the concept of variables. So let's say if you have a query and you want to get the first X amount of items, you could, if you wanted to, put that in line like this and just say first one or first two, and I'll get 2 items back. But the problem with that is now this string, this actual string that we use for a query is dynamic, right? So every time we send it to WordPress, the string is going to be different. If we ask for 2 or 3 or 4, the string is different. But if we use variables from GraphQL spec, we actually leave this string a static string, and then we send variables as a separate part of the request. So in this case, it's asking for a variable first, and we can name our variables whatever we want. So I could say just some random name. I get to choose what that name is. And if I want to send that as the value of that variable is 1, I'm going to get 1 back. If I want to send the value of that variable is 2 or 5, I'll get 5 back, right? Probably want to name it something smart, like first in this case. Right. So if we look at the actual network request that's happening here, when I execute this, you'll see the actual request that goes out is the name of the operation, which comes from here. You'll get the query, which is this static string, and then you'll get variables, which is this JSON object. So that's the actual request that goes out. The benefit of leaving your queries static like this as just a regular static string is that things like the WordPress server can actually take that string and do caching against it, right? So if this request comes in again, we can cache this entire response against this as our cache key, and I can just return the cached response without having to execute a single thing, right? So I can have this deeply nested query for data, and I can cache the entire response if I want. But if the string itself was dynamic, that gets obviously really difficult to, use as a cache key. There's other benefits as well, but that's just one. So we can look at using many variables, right? So this is a semi-complicated query where I'm asking for the first, last, after, and before, where. So If I just execute this without passing any variables, it's still going to execute, just assuming that these variables are null values. So I'm going to get by default, I'm going to get 10 posts, and then I'm going to get these fields back in response. But I can use these variables. So I could say first like 1, and you'll see I'll get this cursor. Does it have a next page, have previous page, start cursor, and end cursor? So in this case, I can ask for just 1, and you'll see has next page is now true, because in this data set, I don't have that many things. But if I ask for only 1, it knows that I have more things. So I can now take this end cursor, and I can paginate my data. So I can say after this cursor. So now I want the first item, the first 1 item after this cursor. This cursor is a reference to the last node in the response. So I can execute this query, and now I'll get the next one. And then same thing, I can keep paginating this way if I want. So you'll see the response here is hello world. I'm asking for the first one after that, and I can execute that, and I'm going to get something else. Same thing, I can ask for the one before it. So if I'm doing this properly, I'm going to say, oops, before. I want the last post before this cursor. So we went forward 1 and we got tiled gallery. If we go backward 1, it should be back to hello world. So now I can do forward and backward pagination very efficiently, because in my query, I can ask for the appropriate information I need to paginate, which is this cursor information. Does it have a next page or a previous page? And if so, I can refetch using this cursor to go forward or backward. Directives are a pretty cool feature of the GraphQL spec as well. So this is a semi-complicated query as well, or looks complicated. It's really not, but these are called directives here. And GraphQL by default ships with a directive called include and another one called skip. But in this case, so we can set a variable, include field, and if that variable is true, it will include the fields that it's next to. So it'll include link, and then it'll include page info. So you see I get page info and I get link. But if this variable were set to false, then these fields, page info and link, would be left out. So I can re-execute that with changing my variable, and you'll see I don't get page info and I don't get link. So I can do some really powerful things at the query layer, right? So in my React application or my Vue application or whatever it might be, I can set a variable that says, if condition is met, include this field. But if the condition isn't met, like if it's an not authenticated user maybe, or user with a certain role, or if I'm on a certain route that shouldn't have this data, I can include it or not include it. So things like that is very powerful stuff. And then another thing is called unions. So sometimes we don't know what kind of data we're going to get until the server actually executes and gets us data back. So that's called a union. So posts have connections to terms, but you might not always know what kind of term it is. And each term has different properties, right? We have categories that might have their own term meta. We have tags that might have their own properties as well. So in this case, I'm going to ask for a list of terms on the post. And if it turns out the term's a category, I want these fields. But if it turns out the term's a tag, I want these fields. So I can execute and I can get back this. So I'll get a list of terms. In this case, it's a category. So I get the fields that I asked for category, ID, name, and slug. In this case, it's a tag. And if it's a tag, I want it just slug and link, right? So very powerful stuff. Let's see, custom post type support. You can very easily add support for GraphQL when you're registering a post type, showing GraphQL true, and then you have to give it a GraphQL single name and a GraphQL plural name. Someone's asking me to zoom in. That's, I think, as high as I can go. So yeah, if you're registering post type, you need these 3 fields, showing GraphQL true, GraphQL single name, GraphQL plural name. These need to be strings without any special characters. Same thing with registering a taxonomy. You just need these 3, same thing, shown GraphQL true, single name, and plural name. And then that'll automatically get added to your schema for you. And I'll show what that looks like. And then if you want to expose a custom field, I think somebody asked already, if I want to expose a custom field, since I just registered this in my GraphQL schema, now I'm going to have a book type in my schema. Now I can filter GraphQL book fields, which is going to give me an array of fields. And then I can define my own fields. So I can say on book, I want this price field, and I want that to resolve as a string. And my resolve function, I'm going to get the post object passed to this callback, and then I can do something with it. So in my case, I'm going to return the post meta for the price meta. And I think I have that, yeah, right here. So in action, since I registered my post type, now I have books as a query that I can query against. And now I have price because I also have genres because I was the custom taxonomy that I registered support for. And I have price because I just filtered in a custom field. So now I can query for the genres that the book is connected to and the price of the book. And then you can actually see this being rendered. So we can take this query, which is going to get a list of posts and a list of categories. Or actually, this query is, oh, dang it. I didn't update that. This is incorrect. That should basically be this query here. Sorry about that. We should be querying for books here. Sorry about that. But anyway, I can do what I did in my earlier example, and I can map over those books, and I can output them now. So I get my price, my custom field, right? WordCamp Phoenix. I showed this at WordCamp Phoenix, $9.99 using GraphQL with WordPress.
We have a request for you to maybe zoom in your browser a little bit so that we can see. We have a request in chat for you to zoom in your browser. If at all possible.
Yeah, I zoomed in kind of.
Pretty zoomed in, yeah.
As much as I think I
think it's great. Thank you.
Yeah. But yeah, so this is an example of just taking the response from that query and actually rendering it in a component, right? So I'm getting the title of the book, the price of the book, the image of the book. I get to output the avatar of the author and whatnot. So that's an example. So I'm getting short on time, so let me jump over to how we can use some of this technology with Gutenberg. You can do mutations, but I'm not going to talk about that right now. But yeah, go check it out. WPGraphQL.com. There's some documentation on it. And yeah, contribute if you find some missing documentation, which there's plenty of. Yeah, so let me go show some stuff about Gutenberg now. All right. Oops. All right. So WordPress is graph. Let's see. We've already activated it. So now we're going to look at building Guten blocks with WP GraphQL. I put up a plugin right here, github.com, wp-graphql/GraphQL-Guten block example. I committed it in basically 5 steps. I scaffolded the plugin using create Guten block by Amada Weiss. Awesome plugin to get started with Gutenberg. Scaffold out the plugin with that, and then I basically went step by step, 5 steps to get to a final product. This is what it's going to look like when we're done building it. I'm just going to really quick touch on some of the high levels. So basically, it's a recent post block that gets the data from GraphQL. So what do we need? So we're getting a list of recent posts here. Let's break down our data dependencies. So on this, we need a list of posts, obviously. We need the post ID because as you iterate over components, when you map over components, you need an ID or a key for each React component. We need the post title. We need the post featured image URL. We need the author avatar URL, the author first and last name, the post tags, the names. Oh, and I forgot the date too. So in simple terms, this is what we need. We need the posts, we need the ID, the title, the date, the author of each one. And on the author, we need the avatar and the URL. We need the featured image of the post and the URL. And on each tag, we need an ID and a name. So our data dependencies look an awful lot like a GraphQL query, where I can just ask for exactly what I need, right? So then I can take that query, this string, I can copy that into my graphical, my WP GraphQL, wherever I was. I have it closed. I can just literally copy my data dependency string. Oh, now I'm freezing. All right. Oops. Will it let me copy? There we go. So I can copy, we can plan this list in plain English, right, with a product manager or whatever. Then I can execute this query. I have the stuff I need. All I need to do is render my HTML now, right? So let's take a look at some actual code real quick. I'm pretty short on time, so I'll just pull up the final plugin real quick. I have an image directory that shows kind of the state of the block at each step. So this is us mocking out some data to render the blocks using the queries. So you can go step by step if you follow the GitHub repo. I'm going to pull up just real quick some JavaScript, pretty easy. So Gutenberg has a register block type. What we're going to do is register block type. We're going to call it GraphQL recent posts, give it a title, category, and icon. And then we have this edit component. This is going to return this edit post component. Edit post is a React component or a Gutenberg component. What we're going to first do is when we first set this up, we're going to set the initial state, and we're going to have posts as null. There's no posts at all on this yet. We have a method to fetch posts. This is going to use the Gutenberg data API to select the post ID from the core editor store in the Redux store. I'm going to use that post ID as a variable in my GraphQL query. So I'm going to send a query to get recent posts. That query is defined just like what we defined earlier. It's a string, and I'm using a fragment for tags. And I'm saying I have an ID that's expecting an integer. So I'm gonna use that to fetch. So I'm pass my query string, and I pass my variables. What I'm doing here, the ID for the post ID, is simply asking, I want a list of posts, but I don't want to include the current post that I'm on, right? I want to dedupe the post that I'm looking at. Then when I get that response back, so I'm going to fetch the post. When I get the response, I'm going to set the state. I'm going to take the post from my response, set my state. That's going to automatically re-render this. So my edit component is going to render a loading screen. But if it has posts, then it's going to render this render post component. Render post component simply just takes the post, maps through it, renders this postcard component. And this postcard component is a very simple component as well. It plucks out some data from the node that's passed to it, and then it renders it into a card component, uses an H2 and H4, and then this tags component. I broke out this tags component to show how to use fragments in a React or Vue application. So I can write my fragment here and couple it with my component. My tags component requires tag nodes, so I can ask for that in my fragment. I need tag nodes. If I ever need to update this, like get a link, because I'm going to render a link, I can manage my data dependencies at the same place that I manage my rendering for my component, right? So very easy. I don't have to crawl around my application to figure out how to get extra data for my stuff. And so yeah, the end result of this is a Gutenberg block right here. So I can add this, search for recent posts. You'll see it shows loading, and then it loads. You can see behind the scenes, it's creating a fetch to go get my data, and it responds with just the exact data that I asked for. You'll see the load times are pretty small. If you compare this GraphQL request, the response time, to like the API request, the REST API request it would take to get the same data, it'll blow your mind. I think I'm out of time though, so let's see. Let me see what questions I got. Curious if when you do things like posts and users, is it pulling in all one SQL query? If you have 1,000 users, are you doing one query for the user and 1,000 posts looping through, or does GraphQL combine the request? So that's a good question. So WP GraphQL uses a lot of WordPress internals. Like WP query is actually pretty efficient, and it does like if you do a WP query, it does an initial lookup of IDs, and then it comes back through and loads the full objects, right? So if you did a GraphQL query to get posts and then categories and then posts again, it'll defer getting all the posts for one query. So it'll do an initial lookup to get the IDs that you asked for, and then do another lookup for IDs, but then it'll get the full object later and return that later. So it is pretty efficient. It's a concept called data loading. WordPress actually does a lot of that by default, but GraphQL ecosystem has something called data loading, and we're kind of merging WordPress internals with that. So it's very efficient, especially compared when you're getting multiple resources where you normally would have to go hit one endpoint that has no knowledge of your previous resource hit. So you can do very efficient stuff there. Can we search post meta? So post meta right now, since there's not like a super strong like meta registration API, there is register meta, I think, or register rest field or whatever it might be. But there's not a super strong meta registration API. So right now you'd have to filter in meta fields on your own. Someone at Human made, Rob O'Rourke, I believe, made something to hook WP GraphQL into register meta. I also have a beta plugin for hooking in advanced custom fields with WP GraphQL. Super, super beta though. Will today's talk be available to watch later? I believe so. Zach said he'll be putting them up. Could I zoom in the screen? That's an old question. What happens if you register something as an integer or float, but the data actually turns as a string? So that's good. So GraphQL expects a contract to be created, right? So on the server, you register a schema and you say, hey, this field's going to be a string or an integer or a float, like you said, or maybe a post is the type it's going to return. So you just have to guarantee, as a backend developer that's resolving this data, you have to guarantee that you're returning the type. If you return something that doesn't work, like if you do try and return an integer for a string field, it'll throw an exception. And you'll see actually like what an error looks like. I can show you real quick. So GraphQL will give errors back if you do something wrong. Like, let's say if I ask for something that doesn't exist, for example, I can get errors back. Sometimes if you ask for something valid, but it had a problem resolving it, you'll get a partial resolution and then an error in addition to it. So that's one thing. Let's see. What happens if you register? Oh, okay, I just asked that. You can look at previous talks right now. Okay, cool. Yeah, so I've also done several talks. I did a talk at WordCamp US covering stuff. I did a talk at WordCamp Phoenix. So this stuff's on WordCamp or WordPress.tv. Got some videos on YouTube as well. You can find me at WPGraphQL.com, at WP GraphQL on Twitter, at Jason Bahl on Twitter. We have a Slack if you want to join. There's a link on the WP GraphQL repo. Looking for help if people are interested. Love contributions.
Thanks for watching this talk from the JavaScript for WordPress conference. If you're interested in more talks like this, head over to javascriptforwp.com/conference to see an archive of all talks, as well as information about upcoming events.